Welcome to Dreadful Visions, where we delve into the darkest depths of horror. Don't miss out on our terrifying tales. Subscribe now and join us on our journey into the unknown.
Story 1. The Night Whispers. Roommates. They're supposed to be people you can live with, share space with, maybe even become friends with. But sometimes things can go horribly wrong. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how my seemingly ordinary college roommate turned my life into a waking nightmare. I was a sophomore at a mid-sized university in the Midwest. My freshman year, I'd lived in a dorm with a girl who became my best friend, Emily. But by the time our second year rolled around, she had transferred to another school. I didn't know many people well enough to ask them to room with me, so I was assigned a random roommate. Her name was Lena. Lena was quiet, almost painfully shy. When we first met, she barely said a word, just nodded and gave a small smile as she unpacked her things. She had long, dark hair that she often wore loose, covering part of her face. Her clothes were always neat, but very plain, lots of blacks and grays. I figured she was just one of those introverted types who took a while to open up. I tried to be friendly, inviting her to join me and my friends for meals or study sessions, but she always politely declined. As the weeks went by, I noticed odd things about Lena. She kept strange hours, staying up late into the night, well past when I went to bed. I'd often wake up to the sound of her typing furiously on her laptop or muttering softly to herself. The first time I heard her talking in the middle of the night, I thought she was on the phone, but when I peeked out from under my covers, I saw her sitting at her desk, alone in the dark, whispering to no one. At first, I thought she was just practicing a speech or something. Maybe she was taking a public speaking class or had some sort of social anxiety that she was trying to work through. But the more I listened, the more unsettling it became. The words she whispered didn't make sense. They were disjointed, sometimes in a language I didn't recognize. And the tone, it was almost like she was pleading with someone or something. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to use the bathroom. As I quietly got out of bed, I noticed that Lena wasn't at her desk for once. Her laptop was open, casting a faint glow on her side of the room, but she wasn't there. I glanced at her bed, thinking maybe she had finally gone to sleep, but it was empty. Confused, I headed to the bathroom, figuring she might have gone to the communal showers. As I approached the bathroom, I heard something strange, a soft, rhythmic scratching sound. It was coming from the far end of the hallway near the stairwell. My heart started to race as I crept closer, the sound growing louder with each step. When I finally reached the corner, I peeked around and felt my blood run cold. Lena was crouched on the floor, facing the wall, her long hair hanging in front of her face. She was scratching at the wall with her fingernails, mumbling to herself in that same eerie whisper. The sound of her nails against the concrete was like nails on a chalkboard, sending shivers down my spine. I was frozen in place, too terrified to move, as I listened to her whisper, "He's coming, he's coming, he's coming." I didn't know what to do. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around and run back to the room, but I was also afraid that if I moved, she'd notice me. I stood there, paralyzed, until she suddenly stopped. The scratching ceased, and the hallway fell into an eerie silence. Then, slowly, she turned her head and looked right at me. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with a kind of madness I had never seen before. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and then she spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "He's almost here." I didn't wait to find out what she meant. I turned and bolted back to our room, slamming the door shut behind me. I stood there, shaking, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. A few minutes later, Lena returned, as if nothing had happened. She didn't say a word to me, just crawled into bed and turned off the light. The next morning, I tried to talk to her about what had happened, but she acted like she didn't know what I was talking about. Her demeanor was so calm, so normal, that I started to doubt my own memory. Maybe I had imagined it? Maybe it was just a sleep-deprived hallucination? But over the next few weeks, things only got worse. Lena's nighttime whispering grew louder, more frantic. Sometimes I'd hear her pacing around the room, muttering to herself, or see her standing in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection for hours. I started sleeping with earplugs in, just to drown out the noise, but even that didn't help. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, constantly on edge, waiting for something to happen. And then, one night, it did. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing. I groggily opened my eyes, my vision blurry from sleep, and saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It took me a moment to realize it was Lena. She was standing there, just staring at me, her breathing shallow and rapid. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, trying to figure out what was going on. "Lena?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. Instead, she took a step closer, her hands twitching at her sides. I noticed that her fingernails were ragged and broken, like she had been scratching at something again. There was a wild look in her eyes, and for the first time, I was genuinely afraid of her. I slowly reached for my phone, which was on the nightstand next to me, but before I could grab it, Lena lunged at me. She grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, her nails digging into my skin as she hissed, "He's here. He's here." I screamed and struggled to pull away, but she held on tight, her grip like iron. I could feel her breath on my face, hot and frantic, as she repeated over and over, "He's here. He's here." In a panic, I kicked her as hard as I could, knocking her back just enough for me to break free. I scrambled out of bed and ran out of the room, not stopping until I was at the RA's door. I banged on it, yelling for help, until the RA finally opened up, groggy and confused. I told her everything about Lena's strange behavior, the whispering, the scratching, and what had just happened. She called campus security, and they arrived a few minutes later to take Lena away. As they escorted her out of the building, she kept looking over her shoulder, muttering to herself, "He's here. He's here." The next day, I found out that Lena had been taken to the campus mental health facility for evaluation. They said she was suffering from a severe psychotic episode, triggered by stress and lack of sleep. They assured me that she would get the help she needed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something darker that I couldn't explain. I moved out of the dorms after that, opting to live off campus with a couple of friends. But the experience stayed with me, haunting my dreams and making me wary of anyone I lived with. I never found out what exactly Lena had been going through, or who, or what she thought was coming for her. But one thing is certain, that night changed me forever. Even now, years later, I still hear her voice in my head sometimes, whispering in the dark, "He's here. He's here." And every time, I can't help but wonder if she was right. That was the first story from 5 disturbing true roommate horror stories. The rest of the stories only get darker, each one exploring the terrifying possibilities that can come from sharing your living space with someone you don't really know. Stay tuned, because the next story will leave you questioning just how well you know the people around you.
College was supposed to be the best time of my life. A fresh start, new friends, and a chance to discover who I was away from home. But what I ended up discovering was something much more sinister. My name is Tom, and this is the story of how my college roommate became my worst nightmare. It all started during my sophomore year. I had decided to switch roommates after my first year because my previous one had transferred to a different school. The university's housing office paired me with a guy named Ethan. At first glance, Ethan seemed like a nice enough guy, polite, soft-spoken, and always willing to help out. He was the kind of person who would go out of his way to do little things for you, like picking up groceries or bringing you coffee. But it didn't take long for things to start feeling off. Ethan was always around. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. After all, we lived together, so it made sense that we'd see each other a lot. But as the weeks went by, I started to realize that it was more than just coincidence. No matter where I went or what I did, Ethan was always there. If I went to the library to study, he'd show up not long after and sit at the table across from me. If I went to the gym, he'd be there on the treadmill next to me. Even when I went out with friends, he somehow managed to find us and tag along. First, I brushed it off. Maybe he just didn't know many people and was trying to be friendly. But then the messages started. I'd get random texts from him throughout the day, asking where I was, what I was doing, or who I was with. They were innocent enough at first, but then they started getting more personal. He'd ask me why I hadn't told him I was going out, or why I didn't invite him along. If I didn't respond right away, he'd send multiple messages, asking if I was okay or if I was mad at him. It started to feel suffocating. No matter where I was or what I was doing, Ethan always seemed to be watching me. I began to avoid him, spending more time out of the dorm and with other friends. But no matter how hard I tried to distance myself, he always found a way to insert himself into my life. One night, I came back to the dorm after hanging out with some friends, hoping to grab a quick shower and get to bed early. As I walked into the room, I noticed that Ethan was sitting at his desk, staring at something on his laptop. He didn't look up as I entered, but I could feel his eyes on me as I moved around the room. I tried to ignore him, grabbing my towel and heading for the bathroom. As I stepped into the shower, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was like I was being watched, even though I knew I was alone. I quickly finished up and went back to the room, only to find Ethan still sitting at his desk, his eyes locked onto his screen. "Hey, Ethan," I said, trying to sound casual. "What are you working on?" He looked up at me, a strange smile on his face. "Just some stuff for class," he replied, his tone a little too cheerful. I nodded and turned away, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease. As I sat down at my desk to check my email, I glanced over at Ethan's screen, hoping to catch a glimpse of what he was doing. To my shock, I saw that he had multiple tabs open on a social media site, my social media site. He was scrolling through my profile, looking at my pictures, reading my posts, and even going through the comments. "What the hell, Ethan?" I snapped, unable to hide my anger. He jumped, clearly startled, and quickly closed the tabs. "I was just checking something," he stammered, his face turning red. "Why were you on my profile?" I demanded, my heart pounding in my chest. Ethan looked down, avoiding my gaze. I was just curious," he mumbled. "Curious about what?" I pressed, my frustration growing. "Why are you always around? Why do you keep messaging me? What's going on with you?" He finally looked up at me, and the look in his eyes sent a chill down my spine. "I just want to be close to you," he said softly. "You're my friend, and I care about you. I just want to make sure you're okay." I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt sorry for him. Maybe he was just lonely, trying to find a connection in a new place. But another part of me, a larger part, was deeply disturbed by his behavior. It wasn't normal to be this obsessive, this intrusive. I decided to confront him directly. "Ethan, you need to back off. You're crossing boundaries, and it's making me uncomfortable." His face fell, and for a moment, I thought he was going to apologize. But instead, he just nodded slowly and said, "Okay, I understand." I hoped that would be the end of it, but things only got worse. Ethan started acting even stranger. He'd go out of his way to do things for me, buying my favorite snacks, doing my laundry, even rearranging my side of the room to make it more comfortable. It was as if he was trying to win my favor to make up for the confrontation. But it only made me more uneasy. One night, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating. It was a text from Ethan. I groggily unlocked my phone and read the message. "I need to talk to you. Now." I glanced over at his bed, but it was empty. Confused, I got up and checked the time. It was 2:30 a.m. I texted back, "Where are you?" "Outside," came the reply. Reluctantly, I threw on some clothes and headed out of the dorm. As I stepped outside, I saw Ethan standing near the entrance, his arms crossed and his face pale in the dim light. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Someone's been following me," he whispered. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "For the past few days, I've noticed someone watching me. Wherever I go, I feel like someone's there, just out of sight." I thought I was imagining it, but tonight, I saw him. He was standing right outside the window, staring in. A shiver ran down my spine. "Did you call the police?" Ethan shook his head. No, I didn't want to cause any trouble. But I'm scared, Tom. I don't know what to do. I didn't know what to think. Part of me wondered if this was just another ploy for attention, but another part of me saw the genuine fear in his eyes. I decided to take him seriously. Okay, let's go back inside and call campus security, I suggested. He nodded, and we headed back to our room. I made the call, and security arrived a short time later to check the area. They didn't find anything, but they promised to keep an eye out. The next few days were tense. Ethan was on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, Ethan's fear seemed to vanish. He became more relaxed, more cheerful, and started talking about how things were getting better. I was relieved, but also suspicious. Had it all been a lie? A way to get my attention? I didn't know what to believe. Then, one night, everything changed. I was studying late in the library, trying to catch up on some work, when I got a call from Ethan. His voice was frantic, barely coherent. "Tom, he's here. He's in the room." I felt my heart drop into my stomach. "What? Who's in the room?" "The guy who's been following me. He broke in. He's going through your stuff." I didn't wait to hear more. I grabbed my things and sprinted back to the dorm. As I reached our floor, I saw the door to our room was wide open. My heart was pounding as I approached, half expecting to find some intruder ransacking the place. But when I walked in, the room was empty. Empty except for Ethan, who was standing in the middle of the room, holding a knife. "What the hell, Ethan?" I gasped, taking a step back. He looked at me, his eyes wild and desperate. "I had to do it, Tom. I had to protect you." My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Protect me from what?" "From him," Ethan shouted, his voice shaking. "He was here. He was going through your stuff, trying to get to you, but there was no one else in the room. No sign of a struggle, no sign of anyone having been there at all. It was just Ethan and me, and the knife in his hand." "Put the knife down, Ethan," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "You don't understand, Tom. I had to do it. I had to protect you because I love you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had never seen this coming, never imagined that his obsession had gone this far. I slowly backed out of the room, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. "I'm going to call for help, okay?" I said softly. "Just stay here." He didn't respond, just stood there, clutching the knife, as I turned and ran down the hallway. I found the RA and told her what was happening. She immediately called campus security, and they arrived within minutes, disarming Ethan and taking him away. It turned out that there had never been anyone following Ethan. The whole thing had been a delusion, a manifestation of his obsession and deteriorating mental state. He had been projecting his fears onto me, convincing himself that he was protecting me from some imaginary threat. Ethan was admitted to a psychiatric facility after that night. I never saw him again, but I heard from mutual friends that he was getting the help he needed. I moved to a different dorm after that, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, even though I knew Ethan was no longer around. Looking back, I realize how close I came to real danger. What started as a seemingly harmless friendship had turned into a nightmare that could have ended much worse. I learned the hard way that sometimes the people who seem the most friendly can have the darkest secrets. And that's the second story from 5 Disturbing True Roommate Horror Stories. Keep listening, because the next story will make you question just how safe you really are in your own home.
College life can be chaotic. Between classes, studying, and trying to have a social life, it's easy to lose track of time and let things slip through the cracks. But there are some things you just can't ignore, no matter how busy you are. My name is Jenna, and I'm going to tell you the story of how my roommate, Sarah, vanished without a trace. It's been years, and I still can't shake the guilt of what happened. It was our junior year at a small liberal arts college in the Northeast. Sarah and I had been roommates since freshman year, and over time, we'd become more like sisters than just friends. We shared everything: clothes, food, even secrets we wouldn't tell anyone else. Sarah was always the more outgoing one. dragging me to parties and introducing me to new people. I was more introverted, content with a good book or a quiet night in. But despite our differences, we balanced each other out. That fall semester, things started off normally. Classes were in full swing, and we were both busy with our own lives. But then, about a month into the semester, I started noticing changes in Sarah. She seemed distracted, like she was always lost in thought. She stopped going out as much and started spending more time in our room, always glued to her laptop. At first, I thought it was just the stress of schoolwork, but soon, it became clear that something else was going on. One night, after a long day of classes, I came back to our dorm to find Sarah sitting on her bed, staring blankly at her screen. She didn't even look up when I walked in. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, dropping my bag on the floor. She looked up at me, her eyes tired and hollow. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." But I could tell she wasn't fine. "You've been acting weird lately. Is something going on?" For a moment, she hesitated, like she was debating whether or not to tell me something. But then she just shook her head. "No, it's nothing. Just a lot on my mind." I wanted to press her further, but I didn't want to push her if she wasn't ready to talk. So I let it go, hoping that whatever was bothering her would pass. But it didn't. Over the next few weeks, Sarah became more and more withdrawn. She stopped going to class regularly and spent most of her time locked in our room. Whenever I asked her about it, she would just brush me off, saying she was fine. But I knew she wasn't. Then, one night, everything changed. I had been out studying late in the library and came back to our room around midnight. As I opened the door, I was hit by a wave of cold air. The window was wide open and the curtains were billowing in the breeze. I walked over to close it, shivering from the chill, when I noticed that Sarah's bed was empty. I looked around the room, but there was no sign of her. Her laptop was still on her bed, the screen glowing faintly in the darkness. I checked the bathroom, but she wasn't there either. A sense of unease settled over me as I realized that she hadn't left a note or texted me to say where she was going. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. I sent her a text asking where she was, but got no response. As the minutes ticked by, my worry grew. Sarah never just disappeared like this without telling me where she was going. I decided to wait for a bit, thinking maybe she had gone out for a walk and would be back soon. But an hour passed, then two, and there was still no sign of her. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, Sarah still hadn't returned. I was in full panic mode by then, calling everyone I could think of, her friends, our mutual acquaintances, even her family. But no one had seen or heard from her. It was like she had vanished into thin air. I went to the campus police, but they didn't seem overly concerned at first. They said it wasn't uncommon for students to take off for a few days without telling anyone, and that she would probably turn up soon. But I knew Sarah, and I knew this wasn't like her. As the days passed, the search for Sarah intensified. The police started interviewing students and staff, and they even brought in search dogs to comb the campus and surrounding areas. But no matter what they did, there was no trace of her. I felt helpless, like I was living in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I kept going over the days leading up to her disappearance, trying to figure out if there was something I had missed, some clue that could explain what had happened to her. But there was nothing. The only thing that stood out in my mind was how obsessed she had become with her laptop in those final weeks. She had spent hours on it every day, typing away furiously, but she never told me what she was working on. I decided to take a closer look at it, hoping to find some answers. When I opened her laptop, I was met with a password screen. Sarah had never password protected her laptop before, which only made me more suspicious. I tried a few obvious passwords, her birthday, her favorite band, but none of them worked. After a few failed attempts, I gave up, realizing I would need to find someone who could hack into it. I reached out to a guy named Mike, who was known around campus for being a bit of a computer whiz. He agreed to help me, and after a few hours of working on it, he managed to crack the password. What we found on her laptop was disturbing, to say the least. There were dozens of files, all encrypted and hidden in various folders. Mike was able to decrypt some of them, and what we found sent chills down my spine. The files contained pages and pages of notes, research, and strange symbols that I didn't recognize. It was like Sarah had been studying something dark and unsettling. One file, in particular, stood out. It was a journal entry, dated a week before she disappeared. In it, Sarah wrote about how she had been contacted by someone online, someone who claimed to have knowledge of hidden truths and forbidden knowledge. She mentioned that she had been curious and had started communicating with this person who had slowly drawn her into their world. The journal entry became more frantic as it went on. Sarah wrote about how she had started having strange dreams of dark places, of being followed by shadowy figures. She wrote that she was starting to feel like she was being watched, even when she was alone in our room. The last line of the entry sent a chill down my spine. I'm not sure what's real anymore. I'm scared. I think I've opened a door that I shouldn't have. I showed the journal entry to the police, but they didn't seem to know what to make of it. They took it as evidence, but as the days turned into weeks, the search for Sarah began to lose momentum. People started to move on, accepting that she was gone, but I couldn't let it go. I became obsessed with finding out what had happened to her. I started researching the symbols and phrases from her notes, diving into online forums and websites dedicated to the occult and paranormal. The more I learned, the more terrified I became. It was like Sarah had stumbled onto something ancient and malevolent, something that had reached out and taken her. But no matter how hard I searched, I never found any concrete answers. Sarah was gone, and I was left with nothing but questions and guilt. I kept wondering if there was something I could have done, something I could have said to stop her from going down that path. It's been years since Sarah disappeared, and I still think about her every day. The guilt weighs on me, knowing that I couldn't save her, that I couldn't bring her back. I still have nightmares sometimes, dreams where I'm walking through a dark forest, searching for her, but she's always just out of reach. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I think I can hear her voice, calling out to me from somewhere far away. I don't know if it's just my mind playing tricks on me, or if there's something more to it, something I don't want to understand. All I know is that Sarah's disappearance will haunt me for the rest of my life. And that was the third story from 5 disturbing true roommate horror stories. Make sure you stay tuned, because the next story will make you question just how well you really know the people you live with.
Looking for a place to live in a big city can be stressful, especially when you're a college student on a tight budget. You never know who you're going to end up living with, and sometimes the cost of a cheap room comes with strings attached. My name is David, and this is the story of the roommate I found on Craigslist. Someone who turned out to be far more than just a little strange. It was my second year of college, and I needed to find a new place fast. My previous lease was up, and most of my friends had already found roommates. I was running out of options and getting desperate, so I turned to Craigslist. After scrolling through countless ads, I finally found one that seemed promising. It was a small room in an apartment shared with one other person. The rent was cheap, and the location was perfect, just a short bus ride from campus. I contacted the person who posted the ad, a guy named Ethan, and we arranged to meet up. When I arrived at the apartment, Ethan greeted me at the door. He was tall, with a lanky build, and seemed friendly enough. The apartment was clean, if a little sparse, and the room was small but adequate. We talked for a while and everything seemed normal. Ethan told me he was also a student studying art at a nearby college. He seemed a bit eccentric, but I figured that was just the artist in him. We agreed that I would move in the following week. First, everything seemed fine. Ethan was quiet and mostly kept to himself, spending long hours in his room working on his art. We didn't interact much, but when we did, he was always polite. I figured I had lucked out with a low-maintenance roommate who didn't cause any problems. But as the weeks went by, I started noticing little things that seemed off. For one, Ethan's artwork was strange. He would occasionally leave his sketches lying around the apartment, and they were always dark and disturbing. They depicted twisted, nightmarish creatures, faces contorted in agony, and scenes of violence. I didn't want to pry, but it was hard not to feel uneasy seeing those images every day. Then there were the noises. Late at night, I would hear Ethan moving around in his room, sometimes pacing back and forth, other times muttering to himself. Occasionally, I would hear him laugh, a low, unsettling chuckle that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that everyone has their quirks and that maybe he was just one of those people who talk to themselves. But then the sleepwalking started. One night, I woke up to the sound of shuffling feet in the hallway. I got up to see what was going on and found Ethan standing in the middle of the hall, staring straight ahead with a blank expression on his face. His eyes were wide open, but there was something vacant about his gaze, like he wasn't really seeing anything. "Ethan?" I called out softly, not wanting to startle him. He didn't respond. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. I slowly walked up to him and gently touched his arm, trying to guide him back to his room. That's when he suddenly snapped out of it, his eyes focusing on me as if he was seeing me for the first time. "Oh, David, what are you doing up?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "You were sleepwalking," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." He looked confused for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I guess I was. Thanks for waking me." He went back to his room, and I returned to mine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I tried to bring it up with him, but he brushed it off, saying it was just stress and that he'd been dealing with sleepwalking for years. But I couldn't help but notice that he seemed more on edge, like he was hiding something. Over the next few weeks, the sleepwalking incidents became more frequent. Sometimes, I would find Ethan standing in the living room in the middle of the night, his eyes wide and unseeing. Other times, he would be in the kitchen, opening and closing cabinets as if searching for something. Each time, I would gently guide him back to his room, and he would go without protest. But it was clear that he had no memory of these episodes the next day. Then, one night, things took a darker turn. I had been out late studying at the library and returned to the apartment around 2 a.m. As I walked through the door, I immediately sensed that something was off. The apartment was dark, except for a faint light coming from Ethan's room. I could hear a low, rhythmic chanting coming from inside. I quietly approached his door, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The door was slightly ajar, and as I peeked inside, my heart nearly stopped. Ethan was standing in the middle of the room, completely naked, surrounded by a circle of candles. He was holding one of his sketches in his hands, the paper crumpled and smeared with what looked like blood. He was chanting something under his breath, a language I didn't recognize. His eyes rolled back in his head. I wanted to turn and run, but I was frozen in place, unable to look away. Suddenly, Ethan stopped chanting and slowly turned to face me. His eyes were wide and wild, and a twisted smile spread across his face. "David," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I've been waiting for you." Before I could react, he lunged at me, his hands reaching for my throat. I stumbled back, barely managing to push him away as he clawed at me, his fingers digging into my skin. I scrambled to my feet and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I could hear him pounding on the other side, screaming incoherently. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what was happening. Within minutes, they arrived, and I watched as they stormed into the apartment and restrained Ethan. He was still screaming, his eyes wild with madness, as they dragged him away. The police later told me that Ethan had a history of mental illness, something he had kept hidden from everyone. They found more disturbing drawings and notes in his room, detailing dark rituals and violent fantasies. It turned out that he had been off his medication for months, and his condition had been deteriorating rapidly. Ethan was committed to a psychiatric facility, and I moved out of the apartment as soon as I could. But the experience left me shaken, haunted by the knowledge that I had been living with someone who had been descending into madness right under my nose. To this day, I can't look at a Craigslist ad without feeling a sense of dread. I've learned that you can never really know someone, no matter how normal they might seem on the surface. And sometimes, the person you think you know can turn out to be a complete stranger or worse. And that concludes the 4th story in 5 disturbing true roommate horror stories. Stay with us, because the final story is one you won't want to miss. It's a chilling tale of trust, betrayal, and the true nature of fear.
Finding a roommate can be a daunting task, especially when you're starting your first job in a new city, away from everything familiar. For Sarah, the excitement of landing her dream job in New York City was tempered by the anxiety of finding a place to live. After weeks of searching, she finally found a reasonably priced room in a small, two-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. The only downside was that she had to share the space with a roommate she'd never met, a woman named Lisa who seemed perfectly normal in their brief email exchanges. When Sarah moved in, Lisa was friendly but distant. She was a freelance graphic designer and often worked from home, so they saw each other frequently but didn't interact much. Sarah was fine with that. She was busy with her new job and didn't mind having some space. At first, everything seemed normal. Lisa was quiet and respectful, and the apartment was clean and comfortable. But after a few weeks, Sarah started to notice strange things. She would come home from work to find her bedroom door slightly ajar, even though she always made sure to close it before leaving. Items on her desk and dresser would be slightly out of place, as if someone had been in her room while she was gone. She dismissed it at first, thinking she might be imagining things. Maybe she had just forgotten to close the door, or maybe she had moved those items herself without realizing it. But as time went on, the incidents became more frequent, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Sarah came home to find her laptop missing from her desk. Panic set in as she searched the apartment, but it was nowhere to be found. She was about to call the police when Lisa walked in, holding the laptop. "Hey, I borrowed this for a quick project. Hope you don't mind," Lisa said with a nonchalant smile. Sarah was taken aback. Borrowing something so personal without asking seemed like a huge violation of trust. But Lisa apologized, saying she was in a rush and didn't think Sarah would mind. Uncomfortable but wanting to avoid conflict, Sarah let it go, though the incident left her feeling uneasy. The following weekend, Sarah decided to take a break from the city and visit her parents upstate. Before leaving, she made sure to lock her bedroom door. But when she returned on Sunday night, the lock was broken and her room looked like it had been ransacked. Drawers were open, clothes were strewn about, and personal items were missing. Heart pounding, she confronted Lisa, who denied knowing anything about it. She claimed she hadn't even noticed Sarah's room had been tampered with. But Sarah wasn't convinced. Something about Lisa's demeanor didn't add up. Her calmness, the way she brushed off the situation as if it were no big deal, made Sarah's skin crawl. From that day on, Sarah became hypervigilant. She installed a small security camera in her room, hidden among the books on her shelf. She didn't tell Lisa about it. She needed to know if her suspicions were right. And within a week, she had her answer. One evening, while Sarah was at work, the camera captured Lisa entering her room. Sarah watched in horror as Lisa rifled through her belongings, pausing occasionally to look at her computer screen or flip through her journals. But it wasn't just the intrusion that terrified Sarah, it was the way Lisa did it, with a chilling calmness, as if it were completely normal. The next morning, Sarah took the footage to the police. They advised her to stay with a friend while they investigated, so she packed a bag and left, not telling Lisa where she was going. That night, the police visited the apartment, armed with a warrant. What they found was beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. In Lisa's room, hidden behind a false panel in her closet, they discovered a collection of stolen items, Sarah's clothes, jewelry, and personal mementos, as well as disturbing notes and photos. But the most horrifying discovery was a series of videos, dating back months, showing Sarah in various states of undress, asleep in her bed, or going about her daily routine, all filmed without her knowledge. Lisa had been spying on her for months, documenting her every move. The police also found evidence that Lisa had done this before. Previous roommates had also been victims of her sick obsession. She had a history of mental illness and had been in and out of psychiatric care for years, but she always managed to slip through the cracks. Lisa was arrested and charged with multiple counts of voyeurism, theft, and invasion of privacy. The case went to trial, and the details that emerged were even more chilling than what Sarah had initially discovered. Lisa had been fixated on her for months, obsessed with the idea of controlling her life. The footage she had taken was meticulously organized, each video labeled with a date and a detailed description of what Sarah was doing. Sarah was called to testify, and sitting in the courtroom, she couldn't bear to look at Lisa. The woman who had once seemed so normal now appeared deranged, her eyes wild and unfocused as she muttered to herself. It was clear that Lisa was mentally ill, but that didn't make Sarah feel any safer. After the trial, Lisa was committed to a psychiatric facility where she would receive long-term care. But for Sarah, the damage was already done. The experience left her traumatized, and she struggled to trust anyone again. She moved out of the apartment and started seeing a therapist, but the fear lingered, a constant reminder of how vulnerable she had been. To this day, Sarah checks every room she enters, always looking over her shoulder, never fully able to shake the feeling that someone might be watching. The experience has left her with a deep sense of paranoia, a fear that even the most ordinary people can hide the darkest secrets. And that's the end of our 5 disturbing true roommate horror stories. These stories are a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers, but from the people we think we know the best. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying tales. And remember, be careful who you choose to live with. You never know what secrets they might be hiding.
If you have enjoyed watching this video and are a fan of horror stories and scary things like this, please subscribe and comment down below any suggestions as to what you would like to see on this channel. Thank you for watching and have a good day.